And the next panel, I'd like to introduce the chair, who is Katarzyna Brzezińska. And she is a PhD student here in the Faculty of Modern and Medieval Languages at Cambridge. And she's working on a project connected with the memoirs of Viridiana Fischerowa, who's an 18th century Polish noblewoman who lived through and participated in some of the most tumultuous events of Polish history in this period. So using the memoirs as a starting point, Katarzyna's project seeks to examine Polish noble women's role in public life more generally in the Commonwealth in the long 18th century and within a broader European context. So could you please warmly welcome Katarzyna Brzezińska.
Okay, thank you for having me, and thank you, Stan, for organising this fantastic conference. As Stan said, I work on the 18th century, so it's really great to hear some of the fascinating talks today on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker of the second panel today, and that's Olenka Pevny. Olenka Pevny is a lecturer of early Slavonic studies and Ukrainian history and culture at the Department of Slavonic Studies here at the University of Cambridge. Her research focuses on the Orthodox visual tradition in Eastern Slavic lands and on the place of visual culture in narratives of national, regional, religious and gender identity. And her publications cover the Byzantine inheritance of Kyiv and Rus, as well as the Russian imperial and Soviet interpretation and restaging of medieval Rus culture. And currently she is researching the 17th century restoration of the Rus past in the Ruthenian lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Dr. Pevny has worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City in a curatorial capacity and as an archaeologist in Crimea and Greece. So if you could join me in welcoming Dr. Pevny.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And this is I guess the second year maybe that I've been venturing into the 17th century. So I'm slowly creeping from the 12th century into the early modern period. Ooh, one second. Okay. One of the most visited sites in today's Kyiv is the Monastery of the Caves, or the Peczerska Lavra. A short distance away from the monastery's Dormition Cathedral and just outside the West Gate stands the much less visited Church of the Transfiguration of the Savior at Berestovo, constructed at the turn of the 12th century. By the 1640s, the Berestovo church was in ruins, and Peter Mohyla, the Metropolitan of Kyiv, Halych, and all Rus, from 1633 to 1647, decided to restore it. Today, I will reflect upon this monument as a visual document of the cultural engagement of the Metropolitan and his allies with the early 17th century political, cultural, and ecclesiastical realities of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Peter Mohyla's restoration of the church at Berestovo constitutes part of his effort to position himself at the head of a respectable and unified Ruthenian Orthodox Church, and to establish Kyiv as the ecclesiastical and cultural center of the Ruthenian nation, the third nation in the Commonwealth of two nations. The Ruthenian Orthodox Church was outlawed in 1596, following the Union of Brest, when the Union or Greek Catholic Church was created. It was officially recognized again only in 1632. Shortly thereafter, in 1633, Peter Mohyla, the candidate of King Władysław IV Vasa, was appointed Metropolitan of Kyiv, Halych, and all Rus. In fact, King Władysław had aspirations to create an Orthodox Patriarchate under the jurisdiction of Rome within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and saw Mohyla as a candidate for this post. In the 1640s, the Metropolitan and his close associate, Adam Kisil, an Orthodox nobleman, were involved in the king's plan for a new union of the Orthodox and Catholic churches. In 1643, Pope Urban VIII wrote letters to Mohyla and Kyiv, calling upon them to unite with the Roman Catholic Church. In 1644, the year that the church at Brestovo was completed, Mohyla and Kyiv collaborated in drafting a response to Pope Urban and prepared proposals for a new union. They identified the main obstacle as the reconciliation of the Pope's primacy with the Kyiv Metropolitanate's loyalty to the Patriarch of Constantinople. They determined that they would inform the Constantinopolitan Patriarch of their intentions, but recognized that while under Ottoman domination, the Patriarch of Constantinople would be unable to recognize the primacy of the Pope, and the Ruthenian Church would have to act on its own. The procedure they came up with for the election of the head of the Ruthenian Church called for the Metropolitan of Kyiv to select bishops and for a synod of bishops to choose the Metropolitan. The Metropolitan would receive his authority neither from the Pope nor from the Patriarch, but from the Ruthenian bishops, and would only have to send a pledge of loyalty to the Articles of the Union to Rome. The proposal examined in Rome in 1645, and the papal nuncio was instructed to discuss it with King Władysław. However, Mohyla's death at the start of 1647 significantly changed the situation. But let us return to the Metropolitan's restoration of the church at Brestovo. When the Orthodox Church was outlawed in the late 16th century, ecclesiastical property fell into the hands of the Uniate Church. The official reinstatement of the Orthodox hierarchy in 1632 required a new division of property between the two churches. Petro Mohyla aggressively pursued a policy of reclaiming sanctuaries from the Uniate Church. In Kyiv alone, he reclaimed and renovated at least 5 medieval churches, including the Church of the Transfiguration of the Savior at Brestovo. His stated objective was to restore these monuments by returning to the sources. But what exactly does returning to the sources mean? How did the Metropolitan define his sources? Petro Mohyla realized that the Orthodox Church had to adapt in order to survive and not lose ground to the Uniate Catholic and Protestant churches. Like many of his erudite Ruthenian contemporaries, Metropolitan Mohyla adopted Western practices to suit his needs. His služebnik, his catechism, his polemical work Lithos, his trebnik, all seek to clarify and regulate Orthodox custom and practice in response to the demands of a Ruthenian society, which, although still Orthodox in the majority, now also was composed of Protestants, Catholics, and Uniates. In his work, Mohyla employed techniques for the systematization of knowledge that relied on both Western European and Byzantine sources. He approached the use of visual culture with a similar reformative hand. Thus, the mid-17th century forms of the church at Brestovo do not repeat, nor do they intend to revitalize prior Rus medieval imagery. Instead, they articulate the negotiation of Orthodox traditionalism and notions of Ruthenian ethno-cultural identity with the developments of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in the Commonwealth. Recent scholarship has shown that the Ruthenian Orthodox of the 17th century were conversant with the discipline of memory arts, a skill for using knowledge and in some cases for divining truths that was codified in university courses and in handbooks that proliferated across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. The art of memory enabled much more than the storage of information and its rote recitation. Memory's purpose was the composition of speeches, prayers, and sermons. Memory art systematized information for its easy retrieval by using mnemonic images and schemata. The forms and images of the Church of the Savior, as restored by the Metropolitan, must be understood in this light. They testify to a transition from a medieval to a modern use of images, from images as timeless icons to images as sites for meditation, invention, and memory. Accordingly, inscriptions associated with the images do not just identify the subjects, but regulate their reception. Together, the emblematic coupling of images and inscriptions and the self-reflective use of images prompted viewers to see more than the image before them. This use encouraged viewers to reflect upon and contemplate images and participate in their revelation. It also allowed local and sacred history to converge. Like Ruthenian magnates and princes, Mohyla was committed to his homeland, and he envisioned his restoration campaigns within the parameters of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Unlike most early Rus structures that followed the cross-dome plan typical for Middle Byzantine churches, Mohyla restored the Church of the Savior at Brestovo as a variant of the rib-vaulted hall church popular in Poland and Western Ruthenian lands from the 13th to the 16th centuries. The new structure fuses the remains of the original medieval walls of the church with newly constructed architectural elements. In the interior, rib vaults frame stunning frescoes of rich color executed in a late Byzantine style. A similar fusion of a Gothic rib-vaulted chamber with Byzantine frescoes can be seen in the late 14th, early 15th century Trinity Chapel of the Lublin Castle. It is in Western Ruthenian lands and Lublin that Petro Mohyla spent time before coming to Kyiv. While in Lublin, it is highly unlikely that the Metropolitan would not have visited the Trinity Chapel. After all, in 1569, this chapel served as the site of the signing of the Union of Lublin, which established the new Commonwealth state and saw the incorporation of Ukrainian Palatinates into the Kingdom of Poland and the extension of the rights of Polish nobility to Ruthenian princes and nobles. Lublin was an important Orthodox ecclesiastical and cultural center. On the 15th of March, 1633, as Metropolitan, Mohyla consecrated the newly completed Orthodox Church of the Lublin Brotherhood, which, like the Brestovo Church, was dedicated to the Transfiguration of the Savior. The Orthodox Brotherhood in the city was established in 1583 and modeled on the Lviv Dormition Brotherhood, with which the Mohyla family was associated. In 1633, King Władysław granted privilege to the Lublin Brotherhood for the Church of the Transfiguration. However, he also recognized the legality of the seizure of this very same church by the Uniate Bishop Metodi Terlecki of Home. The possession of the Lublin Transfiguration Church became a major issue for the Orthodox, and Adam Kisil pursued its return to the Orthodox community as a delegate at the Diets of 1640 and 1641. Petro Mohyla began his restoration of the Church of the Transfiguration at Brestovo sometime in the early 1640s. He attributed the foundation of the monument to Grand Prince Volodymyr, the baptizer of Rus. In doing so, he was following the information supplied in Maciej Stryjkowski's Chronicle of Poland-Lithuania, Żytomyr, and All Rus. Scholars have now well established that the revitalization of the Rus inheritance in Ruthenian lands was based on Polish and Lithuanian chronicles. The selective mining of these sources led to the creation of a meta-text of the Rus past specific to the Commonwealth. Natalia Yakovenko has called attention to a number of panegyrics honoring Metropolitan Petro Mohyla that juxtapose the renewal of the Kievan metropolitan throne with the revitalization of Rus law and order. Probably the best known of these is the 1632 panegyric called Gratitude. On the inside front cover, readers are reminded of Mohyla's noble lineage. Mohyla's family held the rights of indigenous nobility in the Commonwealth. An engraving introduces the first cycle of poems. It shows Mohyla dressed as archimandrite of the Kyiv Caves Monastery, holding the staff of a clerical shepherd in his right hand and a lily in his left. On his left side, a scepter and the cloak represent the abandonment of secular rule. Viewers are simultaneously reminded of and asked to disremember Mohyla's secular standing, which is now subsumed under the cloak of his commitment to the church. In his sermon on power, featured in the Trebnik of 1646, Mohyla clearly places ecclesiastical authority over secular, rhetorically asking his readers, what could be higher than the power that the Orthodox Church receives from Christ? In the Berestovo Church, Petro Mohyla's donor portrait is set over the arch leading into the sanctuary and under a vaulted canopy of the heavens. It shows the Mother of God presenting the kneeling Metropolitan to Christ, who sits enthroned as King of Kings and Great Pontiff. So this is Mohyla presenting the church, the Mother of God. This is Prince Volodymyr here. Mohyla's work in reforming the Orthodox Church, well, to the other side of Christ stands Grand Prince Volodymyr, the baptizer of Rus. Mohyla's work in reforming the Orthodox Church is being compared to Volodymyr's Christianization efforts, which took place 600 years earlier. But the image clearly is intended to encourage further narratives. Mohyla engages Christ in a dialogue, saying, Lord, look upon this church, which I unworthy build in your name, and him who, having seen the faith, enlighten with the light of your countenance. Let your eyes always be upon this sanctuary. And Christ replies, I look upon it as you will. The central image of the vault above the donor composition depicts the figure of Christ in a circular mandala and is inscribed with the words of the prayer of the pontiff from the little entrance of the pontifical mass. O Lord, our God, look from the heavens and behold and visit this vineyard which thy right hand has planted and perfected it, and fill it with your spirit and bless thy inheritance. While the reference is clearly Eucharistic, these same words were also inscribed on the mitre of the first patriarch of Moscow, Job, and some of his successors. Referenced in this light, the juxtaposition of the donor portrait and the imposing central figure of Christ speak to Mohyla's position in the Orthodox Ruthenian ecclesiastical hierarchy, or perhaps even to his ecclesiastical ambitions. The Eucharistic understanding of the inscription around the bust-length portrait of Christ is upheld by the extended cycle of scenes from the Passion of Christ that appear in the very same bay. So the image of Christ is right here. The scenes of the Passion occupied this wall. They were removed in the 1970s to expose underlying medieval frescoes, but they're preserved. So now I'll show you what it looked like originally. Like the sorrowful mysteries of the Dominican Rosary, collectively, these scenes are intended for meditation and contemplation of Christ's sacrifice and of a life led in Christ. The same scenes, segregated from but interspersed with the representations of the seven sacraments of the Church, appear on the title page of Petro Mohyla's Trebnik. So I know it's difficult to see, but these same scenes are the scenes in the smaller medallions of this frontispiece page. In the church at Berestova, images associated with the joyful and glorious mysteries are restricted to the sanctuary, and those of the Passion to the main nave, where they illuminate the historical precedents of the sacraments and thereby their significance for the life of the faithful. The Passion imagery is brought back to the Metropolitan and the Orthodox Ruthenian nation in the dedicatory inscription in Greek over the entrance to the church. It reads, Peter Mohyla, God's bishop, built this church for the Lord God, our heavenly ruler, having made this illustrious and memorable house of stone, having painted it with the hands of the Greeks, returning the glory which you, eternal, brought to the entire world with your suffering on the cross, and brought to all in the name of God to the temple. You are the firmament and hold the burden of the world in your palm. Straighten this house, rendering it forever indestructible for the glory of thy nation. In the year from the birth of Christ, 1644, November 16th. In the same exact location, on the other side of the wall, there is another dedicatory inscription written in Church Slavonic. It reads, oh, sorry, I don't know. So this is the location of the second Slavonic inscription, and here is the inscription. It reads, this church was built by the great prince and autocrat of all Rus, Volodymyr, in baptism Basil. After many years and after destruction at the hands of the godless Tartars, it was renewed with God's volition by humble Peter Mohyla, Archbishop Metropolitan of Kyiv, Halych, and all Rus, Exarch of the Holy Throne of Constantinople, Archimandrite of the Caves Monastery, for the glory of the transfiguration of Christ, God the Word, on Mount Tabor in the year 1643, that is 7,151 years from the creation of the world. The inscription recognizes Mohyla not only as Metropolitan, but as Exarch of the Holy Throne of Constantinople, that is the highest hierarchical office under the rank of Patriarch in the Ruthenian Rus lands. I would like to end this presentation with an image from the sanctuary apse of the church at Berestova. It depicts the vision of Peter of Alexandria. In this vision, Jesus Christ appeared to St. Peter as a 12-year-old child, wearing a robe that was torn from top to bottom. St. Peter asked the Savior who had torn his garment, and the Savior replied, the madman Arius has torn it by dividing the people whom I have redeemed by my blood. In the Kyiv church, we see Peter conversing with the young Jesus, who stands on an altar. The inscription reads, who tore your chiton, Savior? And the Savior replies, Arius, the mad and all evil Peter. The image is clearly a reference to the early 4th century heretic Arius, who questioned the doctrine of co-equal Trinitarianism, and can be read as a condemnation of non-Trinitarian Protestantism and such non-Trinitarian churches as the Polish Brethren, which found refuge in the Commonwealth. However, it can also be read in light of Metropolitan Mohyla's efforts to end the schism in the Ruthenian Church. Just as Grand Prince Volodymyr had united Rus Christianity, so Mohyla sought to restore the respectability and unity of the Ruthenian Church. Already in 1629, on the first day of a synod called to discuss the possibility of church union, and attended by Mohyla, Adam Kisil, his close associate, expressed the opinion that the fratricidal struggle among Ruthenians must stop. He stated, we all weep at the sight of the rent coat and precious robe of our mother, the Holy Eastern Church. You, gentlemen, bemoan, as do we all, that we are divided from our brethren, we who were in one font of the Holy Spirit 600 years ago in the Dnipro waters of this metropolis of the Rus Principality. He goes on. There flourish organisms of commonwealths composed of various nations, while we of one nation, of one people, of one religion, of one worship, of one rite, are not as one. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk. I'd like to invite our next speaker now, Tomasz Grusiecki. Tomasz Grusiecki is a junior research fellow in early modern history at the Central European University in Budapest. And he specializes in the study of cultural interactions between Poland-Lithuania and the wider world, focusing on issues of center and periphery, cultural liminality, and perceptions of selfhood and alterity. And he has published on these subjects in, among others, the Polish Review, I apologize for my German, Zeitschrift für Ostmitteleuropa-Forschung, Journal of the History of Collections and World Art, with further studies forthcoming. And he's currently preparing a book manuscript tentatively titled Nativist Simulacra, Poland-Lithuania and the Contradictions of Early Modern Nationhood, 1500 to 1700. So if you could all join me in welcoming Tomasz Grusiecki.
Thank you, Katarzyna, and many thanks to Stan, of course, for inviting me to share my ongoing research. Cool. Okay, thanks. And believe it or not, this is actually the first time I present before historians of Poland-Lithuania, so I'm all the more excited and look forward to your feedback. Now, my paper today comes from my first book project, which sadly is still work in progress, emphasis on progress, but the book is tentatively entitled Nativist Simulacra, Poland-Lithuania and the Contradictions of Early Modern Identity, and in brief, it's on nativism in Poland-Lithuania and how it was being manifested and shaped by objects of material culture. And I'm interested in how these objects were often mired in contradictions as I look at things that came from far away and yet were considered local in Poland-Lithuania. So things like Persian carpets or Ottoman costume and so on. So here we go. A young man gazes out from a portrait painted around 1560. He poses in a conventional Atlantica palatial setting, filling the air with wealth and respectability worthy of a great noble. Conveying elevated social status still further, the sitter wears a doublet, a velvet hose, stockings, a black cloak lined with gold and silk, and duck-billed shoes. Adding to the opulence, he also holds a handkerchief and a pair of gloves, garments associated with courtly manners. A high hat lies on the table, completing the image of aristocratic lifestyle, an image which, needless to say, derives from adherence to the latest European fashions. But although based on his projected cultural inclinations, the young man might well be perceived as a German or Italian noble, he in fact is a Pole. As you can see, the portrait depicts Sebastian Lubomirski, a wealthy nobleman who later in life held many lucrative state offices, including the first senatorial appointment secured by the Lubomirski family. And there's really nothing unusual about this portrait. Many European noblemen of the day would have had similar portraits commissioned in which they appear in a similar type of dress. In the mid-16th century, the upper nobility of Poland-Lithuania mostly followed the same fashions as their counterparts elsewhere in Europe. However, things were soon to take a different turn. In a portrait of Lubomirski, commissioned some 40 years later, we see what looks to be a different man. The Atlantica background and the full-length confident pose have not changed. The dress, however, no longer corresponds with prevalent European fashions of the day. Instead of donning the doublet, cape and hose, which were still popular in many parts of Western Europe, in this period, Lubomirski wears an Ottoman-inspired silk kaftan, or jupan, a fur-fitted cape, or delia, and a felt-rounded hat of Hungarian origin. Gone are the gloves, exchanged for an Eastern saber hanging from a metal belt, which is also Ottomanesque in style. over the 40 years that separate Lubomirski's portraits, the man not only grew old, but also visibly abandoned his youthful tastes. And really, Lubomirski was by no means alone in changing the manner in which he presented himself to the world. Other Polish-Lithuanian nobles also undertook a similar makeover, evidence of which can be found in legion of portraits, household inventories, and literary accounts. For example, Marton Czombor, an early 17th century Hungarian traveler to Poland, was quite surprised to see that Polish fashions no longer differed from Hungarian dress. He proclaimed that during his first visit to the country, the contrast between the Polish and the Hungarian attire had been easy to notice, but now both peoples were dressed in a similar manner. So he says, quote, "Polish male garments once differed from Hungarian. Today one can only see a few differences, for both parts delight in Turkish dress." And so this assimilation of Ottoman fashions in Poland-Lithuania has received quite a bit of scholarly attention, so you can see. And art historians and historians of costume have pointed to a geographic location of Poland-Lithuania at the crossroads between East and West, a location that facilitated mercantile and cultural exchanges between the Commonwealth and the rest of the world, and the world of Islam, Ottomanesque fashions first reached Poland via Hungary in the first half of the 16th century, then spreading to all other lands of the political union. Others have argued that it was through confrontation with Ottoman and Tatar armies that Polish-Lithuanian nobility discovered the penchant for Orientalesque fashions, first attending only those who took part in military campaigns, followed by the nobility from other parts of Poland-Lithuania, especially as they fraternized at royal elections and sessions of Sejm. Others still maintain that already the 15th and 16th century Polish, Lithuanian and Ruthenian costume had shared some similarities with the Ottoman manner, tunic being the main part of male clothing until Western European fashions gained popularity in the mid-16th century. So yes, the topic of Polish-Lithuanian costume is pretty well researched, but two important questions have not yet been fully answered. How to understand the seeming paradox of adapting Islamic fashions for the needs of a predominantly Christian political nation, and how could something that we might consider exotic be identified as native in the 17th century? Okay, so let's deal with the first question. The question of how to reconcile the Ottomanesque form of Polish-Lithuanian costume with its purported nativeness has long puzzled scholars. Art historians have traditionally explained the partial similarity of Polish-Lithuanian costume with that of the Ottoman Empire by claiming that the belief in the Sarmatian origin of the Commonwealth gave its citizens a sense of their Eastern origin. And this claim regained currency in the 1947 book called Genealogy of Sarmatism by art historian Tadeusz Mańkowski. And in this important work, the author makes a connection between Polish-Lithuanian adaptation of Ottoman fashions and the staging of the Commonwealth as continuation of ancient Sarmatia, which for Mańkowski was a quintessentially Eastern nation. And he goes as far as to assert that Poles, quote, look to the East, and he means the Islamic East, as the cradle of their nation. According to Mańkowski, this belief resulted in the orientalization of Polish dress and material culture. Seeking reasons for this cultural exceptionalism, Mańkowski coined a new term, Sarmatism. To this day, many scholars follow Mańkowski's lead, claiming that the gentry's culture was rooted in their imagined Eastern origins. Myriads of books and articles have since been written on Sarmatian culture, Sarmatian art, Sarmatian portraiture, even Sarmatian ideology, and many other things Sarmatian. Now, Mańkowski's argument, however, makes many assumptions that find no confirmation whatsoever in historical sources. Presupposing that early modern Poles and Lithuanians had our modern understanding of the ancient Sarmatians as an Iranian people, Mańkowski in fact anachronistically applied the philological and archaeological knowledge of his own day to Polish-Lithuanian epistemologies. Although, according to Herodotus and Strabo, Sarmatians inhabited the Pontic steppe and were related to Scythians, and while Tacitus compares them to Persians, none of the early modern Polish-Lithuanian historical narratives that I've consulted explicitly states the Iranian extraction of these peoples as Miechowita would have it. These historical documents are adamant that Poles and Ruthenians were Slavs, and it's kind of more complicated for Lithuanians, but they were not Sarmatians, so they were not Iranian peoples either. So to give you a better context, so my reading sample has so far consisted of 8 major historical narratives, those being Długosz, Miechowita, Deciusz, Bielski, Kromer, Stryjkowski, Sarnicki, and Starowolski, and of course I've also consulted many poems and other literary accounts, and obviously all the anthologies, and I understand this has to be further extended, but I think it gives me a good starting sample. And I'm not saying that the scholars say the same thing about Sarmatia, but some claims really run a common thread. So, for example, it's absolutely undeniable that these writers take the idea of European Sarmatia from Ptolemy, and when they use the term European Sarmatia, they don't really write the history of a coherent people called Sarmatians. No, they actually write a historical chorography or geography of an ancient place described as European Sarmatia by classical geographers. That's important. And it's a very presentist narrative because it's written from the perspective of an early modern polity that laid claim to the historical lands of the European Sarmatia. Now, there's some important differences, of course, in those narratives. Of course, Stryjkowski's and Starowolski's volumes are more unionist in their outlook. Deciusz and Kromer's chronicles are explicitly pro-Jagiellonian, while Stryjkowski's and Sarnicki's chronicles were politically aligned with the middle nobility rather than with the court. But there are some common claims they all make. The first claim is about durability. So all these authors believe that Poles, Ruthenians, and Balts had inhabited the lands of European Sarmatia for a long time, either since time immemorial, soon after the deluge, or since around 500 AD at the latest. And that's when, according to Stryjkowski, Lithuanians come to Lithuania. And Miechowita, for example, asserts that Poles have always inhabited the same lands, and that's a quote from him. Poles and all other Slavs have been living in this kingdom, making their permanent home here and nowhere else. And now the second claim is about status. And all these authors emphasize that Poles, Ruthenians, and Balts are not Scythians. And that's important because to be called Scythian was really the worst insult ever. And then the third claim was to prove the ancient origin of the Commonwealth's people and the fact that ancient authorities wrote on them. And again, that's really important because it means that they did not come from nowhere like those abhorred Scythians. So when Martin Kromer makes a claim in Polonia that Poles are a Slavic and Sarmatian people, he means that they are related to other Slavic peoples, and also that they live in Sarmatia and they've lived there for a long time. So there's really no self-orientalizing rhetoric in the statement whatsoever. And of course, we mustn't forget the actual backdrop for those narratives, the maps of the European Sarmatia, which emerged together with the European rediscovery of Ptolemy's treatise around 1400. And I'm showing you one of the earliest maps of Sarmatia by the Benedictine scholar Nicholas Germanus, which roughly corresponds with early modern Polish-Lithuanian polity. And this representation was crucial for visualizing Poland-Lithuania among the readers of this atlas, but also the readers of the many atlases to come. For example, in this 1513 Strasbourg edition of Ptolemy's Atlas, we see the name European Sarmatia projected onto the contours of early modern political borders. Here, European Sarmatia is a cartographical unit formed by Poland, Prussia, Lithuania, and Ruthenia, with Hungary added to the picture. So that's a clear reference to the Jagiellonian realms, right? And in this modernized map by the Pole Andrzej Pograbka, European Sarmatia is described as the realm of Sigismund II Jagiellon. So that's pretty explicit again. Published in 1570 in Venice Pograbka's map was one of the most circulated representations of the Commonwealth. Here's another one of those maps. And what's really important is that these cartographic visualizations of the European Sarmatia have nothing to do with Mankowski's notion of Orientalization. In fact, what's happening is something quite opposite to Orientalization, I think. Maps of Poland-Lithuania were adaptations of classical nomenclature and chorography acquired through Western European mediation, and they helped Poles, Lithuanians, Prussians, and Ruthenians to situate themselves in parallel with Roman and Greek history. Although Poland-Lithuania was not part of the Mediterranean region, its people were vindicated by their Sarmatian past to have had a long and illustrious history, which in turn linked them to Greco-Roman antiquity. Thus, paradoxically, what we might call the Sarmatization of Polish-Lithuanian historical geography supported the Europeanization of this polity's constructed heritage. Its past was allegedly as old and rich as that of the Romans and Germanic peoples, and was seemingly recorded by the same venerable classical authorities who confirmed its unchanged location. The assumption that the Commonwealth continued tradition of European Sarmatia was by no means a self-orientalizing maneuver. Rooted in the culture of humanism, this new philological historicism was rather a Polish-Lithuanian variation of pan-European interest in the classical past. Now, early modern Ptolemaic maps were clearly a European invention or reinvention of classical cartography. They did not come from the Ottoman Empire, that's pretty obvious. Polish-Lithuanian costume, though, did come from the Ottoman Empire, even if only indirectly, but it did. Which brings me to my second question, how could Ottomanist costume be considered native? And this question might appear self-contradictory to us, but it's only contradictory if we adhere to Mankowski's views. Because all the Poles and Lithuanians saw some similarities between their costume and that of the Ottoman Empire, they claim no causal relationship between these two sartorial codes. So what's my evidence for this? It's the inventories and descriptions of costume. And there's a relatively high number of clothes described as Turkish in 17th century inventories, and this, I think, suggests that the inhabitants of the Commonwealth made important distinctions between their costume and that of the Ottoman Empire. Because when they consider something to be indigenous, they would really call it Polish rather than something else. And there's a good anecdote in Pasek's diary which clearly illustrates this sartorial distinction. Describing the return of the Commonwealth nobility to their homes after the victorious Battle of Kotin in 1673, in which Polish-Lithuanian army defeated the Ottomans and took booty, Pasek tells a story of a particularly showy young nobleman, and it's really worth citing in full. So here it goes. Approaching his family house, he wanted to greet his father in Turkish costume. He thus dressed in Turkish costume from top to bottom, mounted a camel, and having made his servants wait in the village, went to the manor house. The elderly father walks down the front yard to see neighbors, while some monster enters through the gate. The old man crosses himself in terror and takes to his heels. The son, seeing his father's fear, chases him, shouting, "Wait, dear man, it's me, your son!" But the father runs away even faster. He then falls ill from trepidation and soon after dies. So, it's a sad story, but I think it's pretty useful to us because the old man's pretty dramatic reaction indicates that he did not recognize his own son, thinking instead that a Turkish warrior was invading his estate. So he clearly did not consider this costume to be Polish costume, right? The Commonwealth nobility's alleged sartorial affinity with the Ottoman East clearly did not hold up in this instance. Indeed, the Commonwealth's Ottomanesque costume by no means conveyed a sense of cultural connection with the East. In fact, most textiles used for the production of these clothes were made in Italy or elsewhere else in Europe. And here's a good quote from Starowolski's Polonia. So he says, usually we all use foreign fabrics, mostly German, Flemish, French, English, Spanish, and Italian. Clearly, Starowolski highlights affinities with Western Europe in this passage. The Eastern provenance of Polish-Lithuanian costume is overlooked entirely. The notional removal of Ottoman influence on Polish-Lithuanian costume points to the belief in sartorial particularism. There apparently existed a type of costume which was rooted within the geographical confines of Poland-Lithuania. But what I found most surprising reading Polish and Lithuanian historical narratives is that they don't claim a stylistic continuity for costume in Poland-Lithuania. And often, writers like Grusiecki or Starowolski even maintain that local costume was not uniform or static, but that it was prone to change, often in a whimsical manner. And it's not texts, but images, really, that give this impression of sartorial continuity. And you can see this in this woodcut of Piast on the right, which is in Bielski's Chronicle, where you would look at Piast Żupan and Delia as a viewer, and you would be able to compare it with your own Żupan and your own Delia or Kontusz, and you would likely walk away thinking that Polish costume really hasn't changed that much over all those centuries. So there's a historicist potential embedded in all those images. Or take this painting from Poznań, which presents a selection of Polish-Lithuanian costumes. 4 men in the highest register wear Żupans and Delias, marking them as united in their preference for long robes and in their difference from most other Europeans who preferred shorter garments. Women's bodies too are covered almost in their entirety, in contrast with the more revealing contemporaneous costume of Italian and French women. But apart from foregrounding a local sartorial idiom, the painting also historicizes it. How? So you have those oval portraits within the painting, right? There are a few of them. And it's a very smart piece of visual rhetoric because these oval portraits are there to recall a gallery of ancestors, which was very popular thing in this period in Poland-Lithuania. And this visual trick conveys a sense of continuity between the full figures depicted in the painting and the purported ancestors. As they depict figures who wear a similar type of Ottomanist costume, these images within the image suggest a sense of longer history for Polish-Lithuanian dress. Okay, so this is my last paragraph. Although they did not personally know all their fellow citizens, Polish-Lithuanian nobility expressed their imagined commonalities through the most personal of things, clothing. Costume textured and contoured the social body, marking the wearer as akin to other wearers. The term habit often figures in early modern costume books, a genre that supplied both pictorial and narrative visualizations of the costume worn by the world's various peoples. As such, habit conflates dress, culture, and morals, referring to both external appearances and habitual practice, both costume and custom. As historian of collective memory, Pierre Nora has demonstrated the process of remembering and constructing a shared heritage is often selective, inventive, and embodied. Polish-Lithuanian costume represented an imagined community in as much as it created it. This invented tradition, this sartorial nativism of Poland-Lithuania, is nonetheless mired in a deep contradiction. Had it not been for its foreign constituent parts, the supposedly native costume of Poland-Lithuania would have never emerged. But a history of Polish-Lithuanian costume that is neither unnecessarily essentializing nor excessively orientalizing still remains to be written. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I'm actually working on fashion in the 18th century at the moment, so I'm sure I'll have lots of questions for you later. So I'd like to invite our next speaker, and our next speaker is Robert Frost. And Robert Frost holds the Bernard Fletcher Chair in History at the University of Aberdeen. He currently holds a 3-year Leverhulme Major Fellowship to complete a volume of two of his Oxford History of Poland-Lithuania. In October this year, Volume 1, The Making of the Polish-Lithuanian Union, 1385 to 1569, was awarded the Pro Historia Polonorum prize by the Polskie Towarzystwo Historyczne for the best book on Polish history published outside Poland in a foreign language between 2012 and 2016. And his previous books include The Northern Wars, War, State and Society in Northeastern Europe, 1558 to 1721, and After the Deluge, Poland-Lithuania and the Second Northern War, 1655 to 1660. So if you could please join me in welcoming Robert Frost to the stage.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and a little daunting to follow Tomasz's paper, in which I will cover some of the same ground, but from, I think, a rather different angle. I gave this paper a rather dull title, Some Observations. It's the sort of thing that English historians used to put in the English Historical Review 100 years ago. Some observations on so-and-so of Leicestershire. But the anniversary we have today, 500 years since the publication of this tract by Maciej's Miechowita. I've actually been to Miechów once. I changed trains to Kraków there in a snowstorm in February. So not many people have been to Miechów, I think. But I begin with this title page of actually the third edition of Maciej's Chronicle, published in 1521. If you notice at the bottom there, it's not the first edition. The reason is because this one is rather more jazzy than the first edition, which came out in 1517. That's what it looked like. But this book was a sensation. It had no fewer than 10 Latin editions. It's not quite in the Norman Davis class for sales, but it's pretty damn good for a 16th century book. 10 Latin editions. As I say, the 1521 edition came out under a different title. The Germans rushed out a translation in 1518, which shows what an impact the book had. There are 3 Polish translations, no fewer than 5 Italian editions, and 1 Dutch translation in 1563 on the basis of an edition in a collection of works on travel in 16th century Europe. And Miechowita's Treatise features very frequently in such collections. The Italian edition, this is the second Italian edition, it was the first Polish book to be translated into Italian. It was translated from Latin, not Polish, but never mind, it's still the first Polish book to be translated into Italian. This was a bestseller, and I think it's worth 500 years later wondering why this should be the case and what its significance was. And I'll begin by considering what Tomasz talked about, this whole idea of Sarmatism, because 500 years after Miechowita, Sarmatism has really taken off as a concept, particularly since 1945, for reasons that will become clear. Now, we are told by learned scholars that Sarmatism was an ideology of the Polish nobility. We are told by Stanisław Cynarski that Sarmatism was a political program of the Polish nobility. We are told that it was a style of dress, and we've heard Tomasz talking about this. I like this one. This is one of the Tarnowskis from the 18th century, and I'd like to point out that this is a hipster Sarmatian. He's got a full beard. He's not wearing the traditional Sarmatian moustaches, just. So there you go. So Sarmatians were fashion victims. But there are some rather more serious claims about Sarmatism, which is tied fundamentally to the concept of the naród szlachecki, the noble nation. Now, this was taken up after 1945 for obvious reasons. The class interpretation that was imposed on Polish historians in the PRL and condemned the Szlachta for their selfishness, their pride, for the partitions, the disaster of the partitions, taking up themes from the 19th century from the pessimistic Krakow school. So it was argued, Sarmatism laid the theoretical foundations which justified the privileged position of the nobility. And frequently they say this is like the French, the Gallic legend in France, that the nobility of the whole Commonwealth were descended from the ancient Sarmatians and were different from the ordinary people. They had this common descent which unites the nobles of different ethnic background and create the citizen nation, which has a positive spin on it as well, the idea that the Poles are uniquely wonderful before the Americans and before the French coming up with the idea of a nation that's based on citizenship, not on ethnic identity, which of course in the context of 20th century debates on nationalism is important, because Eastern Europeans were constantly being told that East European nationalism is nastily ethnic, whereas West European nationalism is properly civic. So to find that civic nationalism in the past is important. And there's a famous Orzechowski phrase that was done to death after 1945 and in the 19th century. Stanisław Orzechowski claimed to be gente rutenus natione polonus. I am of the Russian people, but the Polish nation, i.e. my ethnic identity is Ruski, but I'm a member of this civic Polish nation. Now for the non-Polish peoples of the Commonwealth, the successor nations of the Commonwealth, the Belarusians, the Lithuanians, the Ukrainians, Sarmatism was not such a positive thing. And it was not positive not because of the class connotations, but because of the national connotations. The idea that their elites, they were deprived of their elites, who became Polonized and denationalized in the 19th century, which caused so many of the problems that 19th century Ukrainian, Belarusian and Lithuanian nationalists faced. Their elites spoke Polish and were Catholic. Not so much of a problem for the Lithuanians, but more of a problem for the Ukrainians and some of the Belarusians. And here we have Banach and Sisson in a very influential article, a collection of Harvard Ukrainian studies on national idea in Eastern Europe. Certain concepts of community and society emerged that hindered the formation of modern national communities. Now, I'm a great admirer of Frank, Sisson, and so on, but some of the history of the 20th century would suggest that the formation of modern national communities was not altogether a good thing. Now, Sarmatism, therefore, was a class thing that you can condemn for being a class thing. It was a national thing, and you can condemn it for denationalization and stopping proper nations being formed. Recently, it's taken on a bizarre interpretation that's linked to modern Polish nationalism. This is what the director of the National Museum in Krakow wrote in the catalogue to an exhibition held in Krakow called Sarmatian Dreams of Power. Sarmatism appears to be a concept of crucial importance for defining our national identity, by which is meant Polish national identity. It is therefore obvious to ask questions about the legacy of Sarmatism today, when the threat of denationalization is invoked again due to Poland's integration into the structures of the European Union. Watch out! Look what happened to the Ukrainians and the Belarusians and the Lithuanians were about to be denationalized. I mean, I'm not sure that's quite what she meant. I don't know what she meant. But it seems to me that if we're now going to be linking Sarmatism to a narrow Polish nationalism, the boat has drifted very, very far from its moorings. And so I want to go back today and look at what Miechowita actually said and try, like Tomasz, to suggest what the Sarmatian idea, and I will not call it Sarmatism, actually meant. Because if I may have a minor quibble with Tomasz, Sarmatism was not invented, the term was not invented by Miechowita in 1946. Its first use came in a famous edition of the Monitor Polski in 1765, number 30, page 234. Eternal and much-deserved gratitude shall endure in the Polish nation for those who, having thrust off the yoke of obstructionism and indolent ignorance, dared to challenge those graven idols, if I may so call them, of Sarmatism, which for 2 centuries have made our nation a laughingstock. Already the tone is wholly different. Now those constant allusions to coats of arms are passing out of fashion. Now the Polish language, and not just Latin, is flourishing. Now comets terrify hardly anyone, and the sun turns its solemn face upon the earth, at last to be seated at Poland's heart. This is the voice of 18th century enlightened Stanislavian reformism, saying, all of these bloody Poles running around in their żupans and their kontushis have held us back. They are old-fashioned, they are conservative. If we do not overthrow this and become international Europeans, then the Commonwealth is doomed. And of course, it turns out the Commonwealth was doomed. So this is a negative interpretation of what Tomasz was talking about. All of these hipster Sarmatians, fashion victims, going around clinging on to their ancient ideas. They should be looking to the sun turning its solemn face, the sun of reason. So let's go back to Miechowita. Here again, and this is a cruder version of the woodcut on the 3rd edition. This is the Polish translation. Again, now what you notice about this, you have the nasty Tartars on the left and the Polish knights on the right, looking like West European knights. Because Sarmatism is not, or the Sarmatian idea has got nothing to do with any of the things that I have just mentioned. It is a story about where East Europeans came from, as Tomasz pointed out. Now, there's a very interesting phrase in Miechowita's chronicle, where he talks about 2 Sarmatias. There's the Asian Sarmatia, which are basically the Tartars, the Scythians, and there's a European Sarmatia. And who exactly lives in European Sarmatia? And this is very interesting. In Europe, in European Sarmatia are found the lands of the Russians or Ruthenians, and that is a synonym in the 16th century. We all now, to take account of Ukrainian and Belarusian sensibilities, say Ruthenians mean the people who became Belarusians and Ukrainians, and Russians is a later create. No, in the 16th century, Russians are Ruthenians. They're all one people, I'm afraid. The lands of the Russians or the Ruthenians, the Lithuanians, and the Muscovites. Well, the Muscovites are separate there, which is interesting. Are today's Russians? Yeah, well, whatever. Who's missing? The Poles are not there. The Poles are not there at all. Miechowita thought the Poles were descended from the Vandals, not the Sarmatians. So they were different. Now, some of the writings on Sarmatism think, oh well, he didn't put them in because he wanted to avoid cliché. You think, eh? What? Ulevich, the great one who wrote another great book on the Sarmatian idea, he said we wanted to avoid cliché, and he worries about why the Poles are not there, which is interesting, but I think it's quite significant because one of the problems of European Sarmatia is who's in and who's out. Now, we will take this up. What Miechowita is involved in is what I call competitive cosmography. This is an attempt, and the book is a success because Miechowita is a real Renaissance scholar. He takes on the ancients and he takes on the moderns. He is determined to dispel ignorance. He attacks Western misconceptions, above all by Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who wrote A History of Europe and a History of Bohemia. Now, Piccolomini, who later became Pope Pius II, was a correspondent of Zbigniew Oleśnicki, the Bishop of Kraków in the mid-15th century. And he thought he knew about Eastern Europe. He'd been as far as Bohemia, but he never got into Poland or Lithuania. And it's full of misconceptions. Now, it's a bit awkward attacking a pope, but there's one thing about the pope that's important. That's come out of place. I'll just put up the next one on. Pius II is attacked for his ignorance and for having favoured the Teutonic knights against the Poles in the great battles. Now that's what Vladimir was engaged in at the start of the 15th century. But he also attacks the ancients, and this is from the Italian preface to the Italian translation, where he says, he's talking about the errori degli antichi. The ancients got it wrong too. He wants to combat a classical tradition that saw Northern Europe as backward and barbaric because it hadn't been in the Roman Empire and didn't have the benefits of central heating and straight roads. 2/3 of the Tractatus actually is about the barbarians of the East, i.e. the people we are not. It begins with a huge passage on, it's about the Populi di Scythia, of Scythia. These are the Eastern Tartars. And one of the things that's striking about it is that the impact of the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, the whole first part of the book is about the Mongol attacks. That scarring, it's the equivalent of the 20th century wars for Eastern Europe, and that memory is still bitter and deep in the early 16th century. We are not these Scythians, we are European Sarmatians. We're proper civilized Sarmatians. Sarmatia is conceived as Tomasz said, geographically, as much as, if not more geographically than historically. And here's the map about 1460, about 1467. One of the things he attacks is the Riphaean and Hyperborean mountains that the ancients, Ptolemy thinks, run through Eastern Europe. And Miechowita says, well, actually, chaps, Eastern Europe's rather flat. These mountains do not exist. It's pretty big to contradict Ptolemy and Pliny the Elder, but Miechowita does it. Now, I thought the message of Sarmatia has got nothing to do with we are Eastern. It is we are Western. This is one of my favourite engravings from Marcin Bielski's Chronicle. It's paradise. Now, look at Adam and Eve at the centre. I'm not sure who this other lady is, because I thought they got expelled from paradise for getting dressed. But there we go. They're dressed in Renaissance style. This could be a scene from Henry VIII's court. No doubt he found his codpiece hanging on the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He's playing a lute, for God's sake. Now, this is not Eastern, this is Western. What the message is, and Bielski's Chronicle, the Polish bit's right at the end, it's a chronicle of the whole world, with Eastern Europe taking its place within this paradise of lutes and madrigals and all that kind of stuff. Look at 1514, the Battle of Orsha. Here's the detail. Now, these are the Russians. Get it? The message, they've got pointy hats like those Tartars in the woodcut. These are Eastern barbarians. This is the Polish army. Armour, Western knights, champions of Western civilization. Ha-ha! And Miechowita didn't launch the concept of Sarmatia. The Polish kings have already taken it up. Jan Olbracht, Rex Sarmatia, 1514, Sigismund I, same date. Regem Poloniae Magnum Ducem Lithuania, Russia, Prussia, Sarmatiaque, etc., etc. Sigismund August has it engraved on his tomb. Now, I think this has to do with a counterclaim to Ivan III, who's claimed to be ruler of all the Russias. All Rus. Sarmatia's bigger than all Rus, mate. Get the message? This is the counterclaim. Grand Duchy has lost a third of its territory between 1492 and 1514 to those nasty Muscovites. This is the counterclaim. But Miechowita's book doesn't uphold it because he leaves the Poles out. And he gets into trouble because he publishes a chronicle of Polish history in 1519, which has to be pulped. Only 2 copies of the 1519 edition survive, because he's very rude about the Jagiellons, because he's drawn on Długosz, who's very rude about the Jagiellons. So it's pulped. The 1613 Długosz printing is pulped too, because he's very rude about the Jagiellons. Now, day something. Decius rewrites the chronicle and issues his own. Now, there's a very interesting thing about this, because, look at this, Decius issues this book as a supplement to Miechowita's chronicle on the ancient Poles, about the Jagiellon family, about Sigismund the king. He's writing about the history of the Poles. He's not writing about the history of the Sarmatians. And the great histories that come in the wake of Miechowita are the histories of the Poles. This is Bielski's chronicle, where you can see at the top, Cosmography. As I say, This is competitive cosmography. This is attacking the ancients, it's attacking Western European cosmographies and ignorance. And again, it's our Poland he's writing about. The last bit, he's saying, in this cosmography is about the history of Poland. Martin Cromer, the problem is, as Martin Cromer says in his, the first problem is that the Poles are Slavs, as Tomasz pointed out. The problem is that the Slavs aren't mentioned in the ancient histories, not until the age of Justinian that they appear. And that's a problem, because the bloody Germans have Tacitus, who writes a whole book on the Germans. And so what's happening in that gap? And it's the Sarmatians who fill that gap, because the ancients do write about the Sarmatians. And they do live in the Pontic steppes. And there's a big argument about whether the Sarmatians actually come from what's now Serbia and Croatia, or whether they come from the central Pontic steppe. And there's no common agreement on who they are or what they are. Now, Cromer is important. He rejects the Vandal theory. He says, no, the Vandals are Germans and we're not Germans. We're Slavs. That's the importance of him saying we're Slavs. The Poles are Slavs. They're more civilized Slavs than the other lot, but they are Slavs. And Cromer thinks that definitely. Bielski and Cromer do not integrate Lithuanian history into Polish history. Look at this. This is the frontispiece for the rewritten version of Bielski's chronicle by his son Joachim in 1597. There's the Vasa crest. What? That's a whacking great Polish eagle right in the middle. Where's Lithuania in this? Well, Lithuania's up there on the wings. Alongside, I think here you've got, there, you've got the Gediminids pillars, and you've got the Bonosforza's crest there. So, we're just on the wings there. This is the Polish eagle. Cromer's chronicle stops in 1506, long before the Union of Lublin. In the Reader's Digest edited version, Polonia, he publishes in 1577, the edited highlights, he does mention the Union of Lublin, but only in passing. This is Polish history. And the version is given of the history of Lithuania that just upholds the idea that the Poles have had since Krevo, that Lithuania was incorporated into Poland. Now, the Lithuanians fight, as I've argued in my first volume, Lithuanians spend 150 years fighting this interpretation, and they win at Lublin. And I'll come to that in a minute. They were not incorporated into Poland, but now they're treated just as not a Polish province. Look, the other Palatinates are on the wings. That's Lithuania. It's just not a Palatinate or something, a province like Małopolska. This is Guanini. Now, the interesting thing is, in the 16th century, as I've said, nobody's quite sure whether the Muscovites are Sarmatians or not. But Guanini, an Italian who comes and writes, he's the one who really expels them. And it's his last chapter on Ivan the Terrible. This is published in, first edition is 1578. It's the first big Latin treatment of the cruelties of Ivan the Terrible. Big influence across Europe. Big influence in saying, okay, Sarmatia is really, this is Asian Sarmatia at best. These are these Muscovites. We will definitively exclude them from European Sarmatia. Tyranny, attached liberty, blah, 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 all that stuff. And he goes into details. Now, recently, this whole idea of the noble nation has come under sustained attack. The idea that Sarmatism represented the idea of the noble nation. This is what David Altoan, in an excellent doctorate and then an article, says. The nobles in Poland supposedly developed a strong sense of unity and common identity among the entire estate. They expressed this in the phrase noble nation, and the nations merged themselves in there's proper Sarmatian moustache there. That's why that's up there. The Polish concept, argues Altoan, of the noble nation, however, supposes a much stronger, more inclusive sense of corporate solidarity. Rather than pledging allegiance to the king, state, or dynasty, their first sense of loyalty allegedly went to the noble nation. Gente rutenus natione Polonus refers to the non-Polish nobles. It implies that they felt their primary ties were to the Polish political nation, while deeming their Lithuanian or Ruthenian heritage of minor importance. And he argues very persuasively that this is a 19th century concept. It's a concept that only becomes fashionable when suddenly Polish speakers in what's now Ukraine or Belarus or Lithuania face up to the fact that actually there's another sort of nationalism stirring beneath them, and it's not Polish speaking. What are they? It's a problem when you don't have the state. I'm Scottish. I speak English. It doesn't make me English. Donald Trump sort of speaks English. It doesn't make him English. Just because you speak Polish doesn't make you a Pole until the end of the 19th century, when increasingly it does. This gente rutenus natione polonus is a 19th century concept. And he says, naród szlachecki means something different. It's introduced in the 1550s when the Poles start issuing their laws in Polish, not Latin, and they have to find an idea for de nobili genere, i.e. people of noble birth. You have to have 4 quarterings of nobility to get office. And that's what it means. It's noble descent against nobles who've been created and are not really nobles, like Cromer, who's of German burgher background. Oh, we can't have these people filling important offices because they're not proper nobles. That's what it means. And this is quite convincing. There are some problems with Altoan, though, and I'll come to those in a minute. But first I want to argue an alternative interpretation. The ideology of the Commonwealth after 1569, and indeed before, was not any soupy Sarmatism, which is basically what we don't like about the old noble Commonwealth, and we'll just attach it to it. There's no ideology. Nobody ever wrote down an ideology of Sarmatism. Nobody ever wrote down a political program of Sarmatism. You'll see the articles on these things and the books on these things. They never quote any documents. They just assert there's an ideology, which consisted of all the labels we will put on what we disapprove of, like the 1765 Monitor. And it's got nothing to do, this ideology, with nationhood, because the whole Union explains why Cromer and Bielski are writing histories of Poland and not of the Commonwealth. After the 16th century, the great histories are finished. Nobody writes a history of the Commonwealth. Nobody ever writes a history of the Union properly. They write histories of Poland, they write histories of Lithuania. And that's because of what the Union of Lublin says. It seems every lecture I give these days, I put up this slide and quote this. I'm coming to an end. Notice what is said here. That the Kingdom of Poland, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, already form one indivisible and uniform body and are not distinct, but compose one common republic which has been constituted and formed into one people. And they use the word populus, which in Polish, they use the word lud in Polish. Now today we think that's a common people. In 16th century legal Latin, that meant the populus, who are the citizen body. The Roman citizen body could be any nation whatsoever. You didn't have to be a Roman or an Italian to be a Roman citizen. Nation is taken out of it. This is not nation. This is the people. The whole point of the Union was to sustain the separate identity of the Lithuanians within one common republic, not a state. There are 2 states in this republic. This is a republic. And anyway, Altoan I'll just finish up with Altoan is wrong, actually. And he admits it, he's wrong, because Orzechowski does use the term. He never uses the term gente rutenus, but he does twice use the term gente roxolanus, which is exactly the same thing. But when Natione Polonus, it does have a reality, but it's as the citizens of the noble republic. He says lots of things. And ordinary people who are not lawyers use terms gens and Natione very promiscuously. I'm of the Scythian people and the Ruthenian nation. Nevertheless, by both measures I am a Sarmatian, for Rus, which is my fatherland, is situated in European Sarmatia. So I'm a Pole, I'm a Ruthenian, I'm a Sarmatian. I'm what I fancy, and that's very much what Orzechowski was. He used whatever argument suited the purpose at hand. The only place that the Union really gets proper treatment is in Lithuania. This is Strijkowski, who was a Pole from Wielkopolska, but moved to Lithuania and became more Lithuanian than Lithuanians in some respects. And in his chronicle, look, Hank totius Sarmatia, all of Sarmatia, the Slavs, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Samogitians, the Russians, the Wilhelmians, and etc., all the other nations under your rule. He's addressing this to Stefan Batory. He has quite a modern idea of nationhood. Look at this bit. Lecz to był jeden naród. Litwa, Kurlandowie, Łotwa, Żmojdź, z Jadwingami, Połowcy, because they have common borders and they speak with one language. So the Lithuanian nation is separate. It has an identity. And it is formed into one republic. He talks about the throwing off of the Polish yoke by the Ruthenians in the 12th century. This is patriotic Lithuanian. This is the Commonwealth, the Union, seen from the Lithuanian side. And I'll end with this one. What does he say? For the love of our whole republic, notice, the crown and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Ruthenia, Samogitia, etc., through God's foresight and singular favour, formed by an unbreakable bond into one body. That's the language of the Union of Lublin. This was a republic. And I would suggest, to close, that they adopt Polish dress, Sarmatian dress, because they rejected, as Tomasz said, the courtly culture. The court dressed in Western style. And I think it's a return to Polish dress to signify that they reject absolute monarchy and all those nasty Western concepts, political concepts, that Machiavelli warns them about. The Republic is in danger. We have to dress in an old Polish style. That's why they go back to the ancestors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. If I could invite the speakers back to the stage, and we don't have much time, so I think we'll collect a few questions and then ask them at the end.
My question and my remark is to Tomasz Grusiecki about Cosmography ideology. As a Lithuanian, and we Lithuanians, we come from Romans, so nothing with Sarmatia, but also for centuries we love the Schupan, Delia, Pharesia, and all this stuff. So my question is, since you are dealing with the costume, and costume is the area of applied art, have you taken the function in the account? The natural resources, the climate, the geographical conditions, have you taken into the account that this nation was constantly in a battle? In a saddle, in a very low, sparsely populated areas, mostly Russia, the 1612 Moscow campaign, later on all over the place, and maybe they borrowed also something from the Russians, and they needed, their thighs covered in a saddle with a shupan. They need to be worn. They need to shave their heads, to protect themselves from the headlights. Yeah. And if you see the Janusz Radziwiłł in Delft posing to David Bailly, to the beautiful portrait in Wrocław, he's dressed in Dutch, he's dressed in German during the banquet with a huge diamond on his hand because he can afford it. When he is ready for battle and when he needs to raise the military for the military campaign, he dresses, in battle dress. So I think that could be, one of the explanations. Another very important thing, and maybe it's worth looking up, if we're talking the Russian perspective, and for example, Sofia Alexeyevna, Peter the Great's sisters, that's 1680s, and Kalava Prince Golitsyn, who called all of the Russia because he dressed in English dress, and they meant that he was wearing the Western dress, stockings, justokor, and lace. So again, it's maybe worth looking also from the Russian perspective, and maybe that could put in focus a little bit, and not forgetting about the function. Because sometimes it could be explained not by the ideology, but by pure and simple function.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this.
Okay, we'll just collect a few more, and then there's one there, and then Rory Fitz as well. First, here.
I guess
You try as loud as you can.
I will stand up and I will speak as loud as possible. I think it's actually, I have many questions, but which is just one. Thank you very much for your fascinating papers. And this is actually sort of a question/comment to Tomasz. I'm very intrigued by this idea of Turkish imports and crafting, this self-fashioning, the Polish nobles and so on, Polish-Lithuanian nobles. But I have a couple of friends that are interested in the post-partition Poland, such as Anna Novikowska, and she's dealing with the Jewish dress. And she talks about the models of the Turkish dress as incorporated in the among Polish Jews. So I just wonder whether this Turkish dress as an act of self-fashioning is indeed limited to the nobility or not, whether you can comment on that.
Yeah. Rory Fitz.
Great. Thank you. I'd like to thank all three speakers for terrific presentations. I enjoyed each and every one of them. Robert, of course I have to ask you this question. You have to know it's coming from me. You mentioned Ozhorkovsky and you used the term Russian, and I'm just wondering what you have against the term Rusian, for instance. I mean, there's a kind of easy conflation there of Muscovite and Russian when Rus and Rusian is mentioned and I think meant there. He certainly didn't mean Russian in the sense of modern term. Olenka, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the artists themselves in the Church of the Transfiguration. And I was also reminded of the Chapel of the Holy Cross in Wawel Cathedral, and the frescoes there, I think, 150 years prior to the construction of your chapel. But I'm wondering what do you think of that connection. And Tomasz, I was interested in the military dress and the effect of military dress and the sartorial culture that you're exploring, which is something more civilian. But I was thinking of the Hussar cavalry, the adoption of Turkish and Turkic-style bows and arrows on the battlefield, and that intersection and interplay of the military dress of the Polish forces with those of Ottoman and Eastern Asian forces, and how it might penetrate the popular culture.
One more.
Just a quick one. Connecting really what Christina said earlier, the function of dress, but also the political function of dress. But this was before, for example, or let's go to this one. He went to Gdańsk, sometimes consciously dressed in German dress when he wanted to please the Danzigers. And at other times, when he was really cross with them, he came in Polish dress. And that's exactly what you said, the sort of Easternization. It was just Polish dress. That was what we considered, he's coming in Polish dress. And they actually wanted to say, he's coming in Polish dress. They're not saying he's coming in Ottoman dress. So that is, I think, a very clear indication that, that supports your point. And of course also plays a little bit into what was saying.
Thanks a lot. So the question about environmental determinism, absolutely. So a lot of my sources, they would emphasize the fact that one of the reasons why Poles and Lithuanians everything is words, you have to use it. Okay, why they wear this kind of costume is because they go to battle wearing it. It's the best kind of costume. It's best suited for riding a horse because it's so comfortable and so on. And all these things that you mentioned, the utility of the costume is extremely, extremely important, absolutely. And there are many sources that confirm that. The other question was about the question of whether the costume is limited only to the nobility. No, absolutely not. So, really beginning in the mid-16th century, the same kind of costume begins to spread all across the spectrum. So you would have burghers, you would even have peasants wearing that kind of long type of costume. And then Jews, I don't think appropriation is the right word, but they, I suppose, get their inspiration.
Well, look at the response that I was citing,
absolutely.
Right, of borrowing clothes in Poland. So they're wearing the same clothes.
It's absolutely the same clothes, it's just different hues, I think they use. Right. It tends to be darker, but it's absolutely the same type of costume. I think there was another question. Oh yeah, the kind of the more political messages, please. And absolutely, you've got Jerzy Ossoliński going to Rome, performing in Polish costume, and he then explicitly states when he has to give a kind of an account of what happened to Polish-Lithuanian saints. He says, I wore the costume of my forefathers. I think this is the costume Mohyla. I think that's what he says. So again, it depends on the occasion. They would go for different types of dress, absolutely.
I think I will use this. So the question was about the artists. So we have an inscription the inscription that says that these images were painted by Greek hands, but we don't really know what that means. Recently there has been work and 2 artists coming from Greece who worked in Moscow. We have 2 names that are associated with these artists, but we have, there seems to be a connection based on archival material, but we don't know what else they painted for any comparative work. So we might be able to have, I think it's Gregorius, and I can't remember the second name, but some people have argued that the reference to Greek artists is intentional because of the language, the issue of the Ruthenian language and what language to use and the equivalency of Church Slavonic in the Commonwealth. So the whole church is very interesting in terms of inscriptions because, so for example, the Greek inscription is set right alongside the Slavonic inscription, and throughout the church there are both Greek and Slavonic inscriptions. And in a way, I think it corresponds to the effort of Mohyla and his associates to make Slavonic equal, to have it recognized as a sacred language, which it was being under attack. So we don't know. Some people argue that Mohyla is just pushing this Greek issue. Some people say that perhaps these were actual Greek artists who painted the church, but we don't have any further records about them. And Babel, yes. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that when Mohyla looked to the past, his past was within the Commonwealth, right? It wasn't, so all of the churches, there are also Orthodox churches in the area that have the hall form and frescoes. So he was basically conceiving, just like the historians were conceiving the Ruthenian past in terms of Polish-Lithuanian chronicles rather than chronicles that we now use for Rus history, right? So the artists, or at least Mohyla, right, was conceiving of a past within the borders of the Commonwealth. I mean, he was very pro-Commonwealth, pro-Polish, so...
Pro-Commonwealth?
Well, he was also pro-Polish.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, to go back to Wojciechowski, he actually claims, in this sort of promiscuous claiming of national descent, at one point he says that he's Greek, because, by which he means that on one side he's descended from the Orthodox. Greek means Orthodox rather than I come from Greece. Yeah, costume, I'm sure it's functional. I might pick up on the military side. Firstly, any Scottish woman will tell you that tights are not a serious costume choice in winter north of a certain latitude, so you dress was warm. There's a very interesting moment in 1562 at the start of the execution scene where King Sigismund August, who has been known for his ghastly Italian mother, as the Polish nobility think, and is known for pouncing around in Italian costume, he turns up at the start of the scene to signal his conversion to the cause of the execution of the laws by turning up in Polish dress. Now, that's long before the sort of 17th century adoption of Sarmatian dress. I think you're absolutely right. They're going back to an older form of Polish dress, which is not Ottoman. I mean, look at the Tartars with their pointy hats, as they're depicted on the woodcuts. That's got nothing to do with the Sarmatian dress that they adopt later on. The Tartars are always depicted like that. They have these sheepskin hats on. And in terms of military function, yes, they have curved sabres because that's what you use. If you are on a horse and are slashing up infantry, you want a curved sabre, not a straight pointy one to poke at somebody. You want to slash their face open from your horse, so you have a curved sabre. It's not to do that you're copying it from the Turks. You fight the same kind of war in the same kind of theatre of war, so you have the same weapons. It doesn't say, ooh, look. You know, I'm not saying, oh, I've read Edward Said, I'm an Orientalist. Sorry, it's not appropriating their culture.
Is that translated into Latin for poet?
And with, sorry Rory, you can't go away, I'm just about to answer a question. You thought you'd escaped there? No. All I'm saying is that yes, they make In the early 16th century, if you read what they're writing, they make no distinction. They say Russia, vel, Rus, vel, and they say Russian, they say vel, Ruteniku, vel, Roxolanus. So they regard, and this is where the whole gens natio thing is quite complicated, because if you look at the people who really know how to use them, the people who know Latin, the lawyers, the gens is the big thing. The gens is the Slavs, or the Rus as a whole. Within that gens, there are various nations. I read them all out from what Strykovsky wrote on the previous slide. He says the Nazio can be Samogisha, Lithuania. Now that's a very sensitive point in Lithuania as to whether the Samogitians are actually Lithuanians or a separate nation closely linked to them, like the Latvians. Well, there's lots of Samogitians in the 16th century who say, I'm a Samogisha. Lithuanians are somebody else, we're closely related, we're in the same Grand Duchy, etc. So there are different nations within the Rus gens. And I think what happens, the key moment, as I tried to say, is around the end of the 16th century. Up to then, I've spent a lot of time wondering why a lot among the Polish nobility and among the Lithuanians think that Ivan the Terrible is a plausible candidate for the throne. There's a strong pro-Muscovite faction. How can you appoint Ivan the Terrible? He fries his foreign minister in a large frying pan and kills most of Novgorod. This is not a sensible idea. But they believe, they always say, Jagiełło, he was a barbarian, we Christianized him and he became sort of civilized. We can do the same with this bloodthirsty tyrant there. Our laws are strong enough and powerful enough, and right down to the time of troubles, the Lithuanians say, right, we bring the Muscovites into this show, we would actually outweigh the problems. But at that point, suddenly the barbarian stuff and the wars go badly again, and they realize that the Muscovites have a completely different political culture. They actually like tyranny.
That's exactly the distinction I wanted you to make.
Yeah, exactly. So by the 17th century, yes.
They're not Russian.
So as I said, there is a point at which suddenly the terms diverge. But in the early 16th century, when Miechowita is writing, Rus is the one thing. And there's an idea that the Commonwealth is the proper home for all of Rus. If you get the Muscovites in and make them see sense and adopt our laws, our super wonderful laws of freedom and regulating the power of the king, they're strong enough to do that. And then the 17th century give up because they realise that the Muscovites are civilized barbarians. Which is part of what Mohyla is that. You don't want to be run by the Patriarch of Moscow. God help us.
Thank you.
How does Cossack dress fit into all of this?
I don't think we've got time. I think we see that in the final discussion later. We're on the panel together.
So unfortunately we don't have time for any more questions, but you're free to carry on the discussions over coffee. We'll be meeting back at 3:30 in here, and if you could all join me in thanking our speakers once again.